Today I wanted to make a short video just giving my observations on what is happening today in Ukraine. Today is the 1 month, 1 day point since Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And today is a very significant historical moment in this war. To give you a little bit of background about myself, I am a political scientist, I guess. I graduated from UC Berkeley with a degree in political science and international relations a lot of years ago, 1996, when a lot of the focus of the department there was on the Soviet Union, why it collapsed, and all that. After that, I went into the United States Navy. I just retired 2 years ago as a lieutenant commander after 23 years of service. About 21 of that was spent as a supply corps officer, also known as a logistics officer for the Navy. And for most of that, I specialized in expeditionary logistics, which are logistics in support of expeditionary operations, or warfare operations. A lot of that was spent in planning and support of potential surge forces, where we would take pre-positioned logistics assets that we have around the world and figure out how to bring them to a battle or a conflict zone to support operations as needed. So I also studied at the Naval War College, and I've been watching what's going on here, and it's been pretty amazing. Honestly, I didn't think the Ukrainians stood a chance in hell, as most people didn't. And I thought Zelensky would have been dead weeks ago. That hasn't been the case. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been an abject failure in so many ways. And I'll talk about that in another video. But what I wanted to point out, what's happening today, is it appears that Russian forces have reached what's called the culmination of battle, the culminating point. And that's the point in an offensive operation when the objective is no longer something that can be obtained. It could be attained, and you switch to a defensive posture. And it looks like that's exactly what's happening with Russian forces today. They have realized they cannot take Kiev. They cannot capture Ukraine. They can't even carve off big hunks of Ukraine. Although they do occupy some right now, many of those areas are being retaken as we speak. Some of those, the number of or the amount of territory that's been recaptured by Ukrainian forces over the last 72 hours or so is actually fairly extraordinary. The Russians have failed in so many ways. They've failed with hearts and minds. They failed with mainly logistics, though. They underestimated their opponent to a fantastic degree. Almost all Western analysts also really underestimated the effectiveness of these Turkish-built drones. There was a lot of Western chauvinism involved in that. These drones are capable. They use, miniaturized munitions, and there was a lot of cultural chauvinism, calling these things Turkish junk, just sheet metal with a lawnmower engine. Well, we found out, haven't we? But the main thing I wanted to address today is that culminating point. The Russian logistics chain has failed for a number of reasons. One, their equipment is just in awful condition. It's been poorly maintained. It's breaking down left and right. They chose the worst time of year to try to invade Ukraine, right during the spring thaw, when, just like the Nazis when they invaded this area, coming the other direction, got mired down in mud and bog and had expensive, heavy armor just sink into the mud. You've got $25 million Tor air defense systems just being abandoned in the mud. And on top of that, there was this incredibly complex attack that Russia decided to undertake with so many axes of advance. That would have taken an absolutely masterful set of logistical operations to support that. They didn't have enough to support a couple of axes of advance, let alone the many, many that they took. In the end, between equipment failures, the inability to resupply, the inability to stage adequate supplies of replacement equipment on the Russian side of the lines, has all led to this. At this point, the Russians cannot take Kiev. They could grind it into a fine, fine ash. Putin has the ability to sit there and basically turn all of Ukraine into just a pile of rubble, with hardly a living thing left alive from a distance, but he can never take Ukraine. And that's become so painfully obvious. Mariupol has just been pummeled in the last few days. Ukrainian losses are huge, but Russian losses are almost unfathomable. Almost 40,000, by some estimates, almost 40,000 Russian military personnel killed, lost, POW, wounded. 6 general officers killed in this operation. That's staggering. Along with that, several colonels and high-ranking officers below the general status that were heroes in Russian eyes. These are big losses, big public relations losses too. The number of frontline tanks and armored vehicles and a staggering number of air defense systems that have been lost. And those air defense systems have been lost to those Turkish drones so many times. A Turkish drone flying into what's supposed to be an absolute world-class, top-tier air defense system and just knocking it out without any response from that air defense system. It's baffling. But one of the biggest things is the Russian forces have a certain perception has been made of Russian forces. Maybe they can be badass under the right conditions, but no one believes that anymore. There's a lot of speculation that the Chinese would come in and help. I really doubt that. The Chinese have a very long view on this sort of thing. They have similar objectives in terms of trying to push totalitarian regime and all this sort of thing. But the Chinese have a very long view. They're going to sit back and watch what happens here. They're watching these unprecedented sanctions hit Russia, and they don't want any part of that. They're watching to see how that holds out, how the West sticks together or crumbles based on greed. But the biggest point today is it appears today that the Russians are going to be today forced to go defensive. They're not going to be able to sustain offensive operations anymore. They may be able to lob bombs, artillery, and long-range munitions into Ukrainian territory, but they can't take anything anymore. Territory is being recaptured from them. They're having their butts handed to them. And how long do they want to sustain that? The percentage of Russian armored assets that were positioned along the Ukrainian border leading up to this conflict is staggering, as if they don't have any homeland protection objectives anywhere else. This is going to be a massive drain on their military and industrial complex for a long time. They're going to have a hard time replacing this stuff if the sanctions hold up. So where are we right now? It looks like it's the beginning of the end of this war. Honestly, the beginning of the end was day 2, when it was realized how bad they were getting, how bad the resistance from Ukraine was hurting them. But that does bring up the next issue, which is, will, at this point, Putin start using chemical, biological, and or nuclear capabilities? We know that he's got all of those, despite claiming not to have chemical and biological weapons on hand. With all of the talk about them getting ready to accuse the United States and Western Europe of having and preparing to use these sorts of things, it's ridiculous, but he just needs to spin a story at home that gives, him plausible deniability. It's also worth noting that the defense minister seems to have disappeared over the last several days. Why that is, I don't know, but it would seem likely that it's because Putin is setting some high-level civilian and uniform-wearing military leaders up to be scapegoats, and God help them. That's almost a certainty at this point, that they're going to be tried and probably executed for failing Putin to try to bolster his own position. And I'll get into that in a later video because I don't think his continued leadership as the president of Russia is viable. He's really messed up. So that's what really remains to be seen. How does this play out? How does Russia having to go defensive play out? Are they going to sit there and try to hold the bits of territory that they have captured? Because chunks of those are being retaken day by day. And will he resort to nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons in an effort to, in a sense, save face, make it look like the West used them and forced, this to happen? That's hard to say. But for right now, I'll be watching. I'll come back with some updates, and there's some background information that I think would be helpful. But I think what we're looking at is the end of Russian offensive operations at this point. De facto, they've been over for a while, but it looks like they're going to have to accept that for a reality and deal with that. So I'll be back with updates in the next several days. If there's anything you liked, please point that out in comments below. If there's anything you'd like me to cover, any concepts you'd like me to explain, any points from the news you'd like me to address, please let me know in the comments below and I'll do so. And I'll see you soon.